everyone here this morning is related to genetics in some way. We were either formally trained in genetics, we are producers that care a lot about genetic improvement in our herd, we work for AI companies, studs, breed associations. And so we all have this perspective that we're looking at genetic improvement with from this genetics background. So we talk about things like selection and selection indices. We talk about net merit and TPI. All of these terms and jargon that everyone here is probably familiar with. We have that really specific lens that we're looking at improvement with. Now, at the same time, we also all receive messages coming in to us from society. So we know that the global population is growing. So FAO says by 2050, we're going to near 10 billion people. In order to feed all these people, we're going to need to produce up to 70% more consumable foods. At the same time that this is going on, we have climate change. We're hearing these messages that cows are bad for the environment. We need to stop livestock production. We need to eat vegetarian. So the question that we get to is, well, do we need to change everything we do in kind of our dairy genetics world to address these problems? And what I hope by the end of this presentation, we're going to come away with, well, not exactly. I hope that what you take away from this is that genetic selection is an excellent tool that we have for moving us towards more sustainability. And we've used this tool in the past to help get us there today. So I'm going to look at 3 different kind of sections and kind of move through time through the presentation, starting with looking at our previous innovations with that sustainability perspective as opposed to just our genetics perspective. Then in the past, say 10 or 20 years, we've introduced a lot of new traits, and I want to take a look at a couple of those. We don't have time to look at all of them, and look at the contribution that those have had in moving the dairy industry towards sustainability. And then lastly, we're going to touch on those new traits that are coming, things in the pipeline that will help move us even further towards that sustainability goal that we have. Now, as Jay said, there are a lot of definitions out there on what exactly sustainability is. So as a researcher, sat down, Google, what is sustainability? And what comes up is from Wikipedia, of course. And so they say that sustainability is a societal goal that broadly aims for humans to safely coexist on planet Earth over a long period of time. And it goes on to say that specific definitions are hard. It depends on who you look at, what industry you're looking at, and they're going to change over time. So we have a little bit of a moving target here. But if we dig in a little deeper into the research, we come across another definition from Brundtland in 1987, that sustainability is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to also meet their own needs. So we have to meet our own needs today, but we also have to recognize that there are future generations coming along and they need to be able to meet their needs as well. So we can break this down into kind of 3 perspectives or 3 pillars, and we can talk about the social aspects of sustainability, the environmental aspects of sustainability, which is kind of probably what you mostly think about, and we also can't forget about the economic aspects. So if we want to take those pillars and think about it from a dairy industry point of view, what might we be talking about? So for the environmental, it's going to be things that you might immediately think of. Climate change, fossil fuel usage, methane emissions, acidification, deforestation. When we talk about the social perspective, things like food safety, working conditions, and animal welfare we'll touch on a bit later in the presentation. And then lastly, for economic, we want to consider the value of the goods versus the cost of production. And we also might think about things like food affordability, and that comes in kind of in between that social and economic pillar. So to start off, we're going to go way back at the start and talk about efficient production. So that is where kind of dairy genetics started, selecting for increased production. We know that today our dairy cows are much more productive. So they produce 4 times more milk than they did in 1945. And even if we only go back to 1970, we're producing double the amount of milk. And now if we look at the plot on the right, with cow birth year along the bottom, and then we have milk yield in pounds along the y-axis. We see that improvement across time, and we also see that a majority of that is coming from genetic improvement. So we have done very well to be able to improve the production of our cows using genetic improvement. Now, this doesn't discount we've made massive improvements in things like nutrition and management as well, and both of these two things together have helped us get to that level of high production. But I said we were going to look at things with more of a sustainability viewpoint. So what does this mean for sustainability? So as we've increased this milk production, we've also decreased the amount of cows that we need to reach the demand that the public has. So we've increased production. We don't need as many cows to reach the total amount that there is demand for. So what does this mean? We need less feed to feed the population of cows in the country or in the world. If we need to produce less feed, we need less cows. We're going to utilize less land and less water to raise those cows, raise those crops. And we're also going to need fewer replacement animals to sustain our population. And now I've included this plot. If you were with us previously in the 2020 meeting, it might look a bit familiar. It was previously presented, but it shows the relationship between total greenhouse gas emissions and the milk output per cow. So as the milk output per cow is increasing, we're decreasing that amount of CO2 equivalents that we have per unit of milk produced. So as our cows are getting more efficient, producing more milk, we have less of an impact. Now, we don't just select for production anymore. And in 1994, we had the introduction of lifetime net merit. Aside from the Scandinavian countries, this was one of the first national indices that incorporated health traits like productive life and somatic cell score. So now not only are we selecting for production, but we have things to select for longevity and indirectly for health. So I want to take one quick example of how genetically improving our somatic cell score in our dairy population is impacting our carbon emissions. So research has shown that as total bulk tank somatic cell count decreases, our greenhouse gas emissions are also decreasing. So they've estimated that approximately 3% decrease in emissions for every 200,000 decrease in somatic cell count. Now, if we take all of these things together, we have selection for production, we have selection for longevity, and reduced somatic cell score. We can start to think about all these impacts that we've had on sustainability using those three pillars that we talked about at the start. So for reduced somatic cell score, we are genetically selecting animals that have healthier udders and overall the healthier cows. We're impacting that economic sustainability by impacting the milk premiums that producers are getting. Healthier cows, we have reduced veterinary costs and reduced antibiotic usage. So some of that gets into societal concerns of antibiotic usage. There's less discarded milk, reduced culling. If we're reducing the culling, we also need fewer replacements. And we just previously said that we can also reduce the emissions through improving somatic cell score. For productive life and increased longevity, we're indirectly selecting those animals to have improved health. Back then we didn't have that, but now we have direct health traits, and we can estimate those correlations between productive life and the direct health traits to know that there are favorable correlations with productive life and all of those health traits. So those correlations range from 22 to 54%. So if we're improving the health of the animals, we're reducing the veterinary costs, reducing involuntary culling, and we need fewer replacements. All of these things are ultimately impacting our industry sustainability. And then lastly, for efficient production, we need fewer cows to meet the demand, less land required, less feed, less water, all those things that we talked about previously. And all these things can accumulate and impact our overall sustainability. So now, obviously, as we move along time, we eventually incorporated things like fertility traits into our selection indices. So let's take a look at those. So we all probably know that we selected for production and we selected for production, and eventually we realized that, well, maybe this isn't too great for fertility. Because of how our industry is set up, we had that data to be able to recognize that this was not where we wanted to go. We could identify that negative correlation. We've probably all seen the plot on the right with DPR and milk. But so we could incorporate these fertility traits and move our selection goals so that we have both increased milk production as well as improved fertility. So that's kind of our genetics perspective. What about sustainability? We know that reproductive inefficiency has impacts on our industry sustainability. So reproductive inefficiency leads to increased involuntary culling. So as of 2021, the reasons for termination on DHI herds is 4.3% for reproductive reasons. And I would guess it's actually probably quite a bit higher. So if we have reproductive inefficiency, we also have increased calving intervals, increased veterinary costs. Cows with reproductive inefficiency have decreased milk production and overall decreased rate of genetic progress because we're having slower turnover of moving that genetic improvement. If we look at reproductive efficiency and emissions, we know that improving pregnancy rate just from 19 up to 25% can reduce total herd methane by 10%. And so some estimates show this to be a savings equivalent to $49 per cow per year. If we look at the slide on the right, what this is showing is conception rate along the bottom and herd methane output along the y-axis. And each line there is showing different rates of estrus detection. So we have either 50, 60, or 70% estrus detection. But regardless of that, and as we increase the conception rate across the x-axis, we are decreasing that methane output in the herd. So if we take all this together, we think about those three pillars again. For a social perspective, we know that animals that easily get pregnant are more fertile. They're going to be the healthier animals. We have reduced hormone usage, and we have less involuntary culling. From an environmental perspective, fewer replacements are required. That means less resources are going in, and we have reduced emissions. From an economic perspective, decreased insemination costs, decreased veterinary costs, and we know that savings per animal by improving our fertility. So this is going to be a story that kind of repeats itself a bit as we go through each of these traits. So now we'll move into animal welfare. So the first trait I wanted to touch on that has to do with animal welfare was livability. So if you're here at the 2016 meeting, if we look under a taste of the future, Johne presented on a new evaluation for cow livability. And this was subsequently added to net merit in 2017. So he presented 16% of cows were dying instead of being sold in the US. And those cows that are dying on the herds generating $1,200 less income each than those sold for beef. And in addition to what was presented back then, we also know that the emissions of these cows that are dying on the farm have an increase of 463 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. So what also happened in that 2016 meeting was it was my second or third day of work. And so I was also there and presented on the introduction of developing evaluations for health traits. So then 2018, we had the first release of the official CDCB evaluations for Holsteins. So we now have 6 health traits that we evaluate: milk fever, DAs, ketosis, mastitis, metritis, and retained placenta. The Jersey breeders were excited. They wanted these health evaluations too. They were motivated, went out, collected the data, submitted it to us. By 2020, we were able to also release evaluations for Jerseys, the same 6 traits. And then most recently, in the last evaluation in August, we were able to release evaluations for Brown Swiss as well. So I think health evaluations are such a priority because we know all of the impacts that these diseases are having on the cows on the farm. We know that cows that have diseases have reduced production and reduced fertility. And in the beginning, we talked about those impacts that production and fertility are having on our sustainability. We know that animals with increased disease, we have to call the vet out. We have veterinary costs, there are treatment costs, milk is being discarded, there's more involuntary culling. We get into issues of consumer trust. If they hear that all the animals are sick, we're going to get lots of posts on Twitter and Facebook about what's going on. And we also know that cows that are sick have reduced feed efficiency. So all these impacts are also impacting our sustainability. So let's take one example, probably the most prevalent, mastitis. Clinical mastitis reduces milk production by an average of 5% per year. Those impacts on production ultimately impacting our sustainability. We have an increased risk of culling by 1.5 up to 5 times. And we also have reduced fertility. Research has also shown that cows with clinical mastitis have a 6.2% higher carbon footprint per unit of milk compared to their higher contemporaries. So let's break this out a little bit more. And this was shown in a study in 2019. But this shows the average increase of greenhouse gas emissions per ton of fat and protein corrected milk per parity due to clinical mastitis. And if you just even pay attention to the bottom row, we see that no matter what parity, we are increasing the greenhouse gas emission impacts in cows that are experiencing clinical mastitis. And these effects are the cause of reduced milk production, discarded milk, prolonged calf interval, involuntary culling. All these things add up, and they ultimately have an impact on our sustainability. We also know this from our own data. So back last year in 2021, Sydney Jewell was an intern with CDCB, and she looked at the indicators of udder health as predictors of subsequent lactation performance. So the results I've shown here are for Holstein, and she looked at both lactation 1 animals and lactation 2, and comparing those animals that had clinical mastitis and those that did not, looking at their subsequent days in milk, cumulative longevity, their subsequent milk production, subsequent fat production, and subsequent protein production. And you can see no matter which trait we look at, and either if we look at lactation 1 animals, lactation 2 animals, all those animals that had clinical mastitis have reduced subsequent longevity and subsequent production. Now what about other diseases? So we have 6 health trait evaluations. What about other ones? So this study is available. They looked at subclinical ketosis, but they also looked at subclinical ketosis in addition to other health traits. And that was because subclinical ketosis tends to lend to other diseases happening as well. So they looked at subclinical ketosis by itself, subclinical ketosis with mastitis, with metritis, with DAs, with lameness, and then just clinical ketosis as well. And for each of these, when an animal is getting sick, they are ultimately increasing their methane production. So to wrap all that up, we now have the ability to genetically select those animals that are superior in terms of longevity through productive life and livability, and also through health, whether that is indirectly through somatic cell score or directly through our direct health evaluations now. In addition to that, we have traits that I don't have time to cover, things like heifer livability and early first calving, that if you just intuitively think about them, we're having an impact on the sustainability. Heifer livability, less heifers are dying, we need fewer replacements, fewer resources going into those replacements for the next generation. Early first calving, same thing. We're having those cumulative impacts on sustainability. So genetics allows us to make permanent and cumulative progress, and at the same time, those things are impacting our sustainability. So now we'll move into feed efficiency. And as Jay said, that if you think about dairy sustainability, that might be the one trait that pops into your head that we currently evaluate that is related to sustainability. We know that feed costs are a lot. Stats all along have shown that, and in 2021 it was no different. feed represents 52% of the total cost of dairy production. We also know that there's a heritable component to feed efficiency. So studies going back to the 1990s have shown that there's a genetic component to animals that are more feed efficient. And those heritabilities range anything from 1 up to 33%. With genomics, we don't need a huge reference population. A bigger one would be good. But even with a small reference population, we can make genetic improvement in our population towards having more feed efficient animals. So how does feed efficiency impact sustainability? This might be maybe the easiest one, but we have more feed efficient animals. We need less feed to produce the same amount of product. If they need less feed, they're also producing less waste per pound of milk produced. If they're eating less feed, we don't need to make as much feed. And we don't need to make as much feed. We also don't need to grow as much feed. We don't need to water those crops. All those things are impacting our sustainability. Now, even before we had a genetic evaluation for feed efficiency, we were moving towards having more feed efficient animals. And that was through something known as dilution of maintenance. So our modern dairy cows can achieve a much greater level of production per unit of feed today. So there's less feed going towards their maintenance, and more of that feed energy is going towards their production. So if you look at the plot on the right, if an animal just eats just what she needs for her maintenance, we say 1x multiple. If she eats 2x, then 50% of that is going towards maintenance, and 50% of her feed is going towards production. And if we increase that more, that level of maintenance stays the same, but it's now a smaller proportion of her total intake. So now just 33% is going towards her maintenance, and 2/3 of that is going towards production. That's good, but there is a diminishing effect with this. So eventually we're going to plateau, and a lot of our high-producing dairy herds are probably either there or they're getting really close to that. And so that's why we need another strategy to identify those animals that are more feed efficient. And so we had the priority of developing a evaluation for feed efficiency, which is Feed Saved, that was introduced in December 2020. So Feed Saved combines residual feed intake, so taking the biological inefficiency of the animals and accounting for that, and combines that with body weight composite. My pop-ups are a little strange, but we'll work with it. So we have RFI and then a component of body weight composite that addresses the fact that larger cows have a higher maintenance cost and are subsequently less efficient. So through the incorporation of Feed Saved in Net Merit from RFI in Net Merit, getting a $4.25 million per year value to the dairy industry. And with the updates to body weight composite is providing a $3.1 million per year value to the dairy industry, combined for a near $8 million value per year. So now we'll move into some of the things in development coming down the pipeline and additional traits that will move us towards having a more sustainable industry. And we know that hoof health is still a major concern across the industry. The mean frequency of lameness in dairy herds, both in North America and in Europe, ranges anywhere from 23 to 70%. In fact, there have been no studies in the past 20 years that have reported a decrease in the prevalence of lameness. Lameness also accounts for between 10 to 20% of all involuntary culling. We know there are impacts on production, and we know that having a case of lameness also increases the risk of having additional diseases. It's an important animal welfare issue. You'll see clips like that I've shown in the bottom. Your mom sees it, she calls you, and you have to explain what exactly is going on, and that you can't really trust PETA, but you don't really want to have to do that either. And we also get into questions of antibiotic usage when we have to treat specific hoof lesions with antibiotics. If we can reduce the amount of hoof lesions occurring, reduce antibiotic usage also. So obviously hoof health is still a concern, and this is why it is a priority to us to develop an evaluation for hoof health. So last year's industry webinar meeting, virtual meeting, focused on improving cow mobility, and the project that CDCB currently has partnering with the University of Minnesota and with Dr. Gerard Kramer. So the goal of this project is to ultimately develop herd management tools and a hoof health genetic evaluation. Now, obviously, we don't typically have this data coming into CDCB, so we need to develop those pipelines for the hoof health data to come in. We need to develop pipelines for data coming in from hoof tremors. We need pipelines to incorporate that with herd management data, with genotypic data that we have at CDCB, and all these things need to combine nicely together, which sounds easy, but not so much. And we're also looking at the incorporation of a video analytics platform in order to automatically capture the mobility scores through Gaddis. So this would be a way that producers could more easily capture what is going on with their animals' hoofs and their hoof health and mobility so that we can more easily capture phenotypes. To give you just a flavor of what preliminary results are looking like, we have one pilot herd at the moment that this data is representing, with some data both from hoof trimmers that have been specifically trained to collect this data, as well as the video analytics data. So we have, this was a few months ago, so we probably have more now, but about 10,000 individual records from hoof trimmers and near 500,000 of the video analytic data of locomotion scores. About 5,000 cows among those. And we are collecting specific hoof lesions like digital dermatitis, ulcers, white line disease, foot rot, toe problems, corkscrew claw, and other injuries. Gaddis captures a locomotion score from 1 to 100, with the current threshold of 50 being they have some sort of locomotion problem. So far, the preliminary results, from one herd, show an association between those scores and the hoof lesions. So cows with a hoof lesion reported by the hoof trimmer also had a statistically significant higher locomotion score from Gaddis. I mentioned before there are challenges to combining all these data from multiple sources. We also have to incorporate the Gaddis data. And further work is needed to really dig into these and understand the relationship between the locomotion scores and each individual hoof lesion and how those differ. Now, how hoof health aligns with sustainability. So obviously we have the societal impacts of improving the animal welfare and improving longevity. You hopefully will see less of those things and have to explain to your neighbor or your mother. We have an economic impact by reducing those veterinary and treatment costs. We have less impacts going into our production, and we have reduced involuntary culling. So similar patterns going on here. For environmental, we have reduced greenhouse gas emission intensity. So those cows that are having cases of hoof lesions, they have an increase of 14 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. If we can reduce the hoof lesions going on, we can reduce antibiotic usage as well, and we also need fewer replacements. Now for another health trait that perhaps is a little bit closer to the finish line now, thanks to the work of two other interns that have worked with CDCB, Taylor McWhorter on the left and Larissa Novo on the right from UW. So Johne's is a chronic incurable wasting disease. It's been postulated to be a zoonotic disease as well, and it's very difficult to manage. So the animals are contracting it at a young age, but we don't know it. They don't show any of those symptoms for years down the road. This research originally started at Agile in 2010, but we have since received more updated and recent data from some of the DRPCs to work with. And both from using the combined data that we have access to as well as other reports and literature, we know that there's a genetic component to these traits that we can make progress by genetically selecting animals more resistant to Johne's, with heritability estimates ranging from about 5 to 18%. Now for Johne's and sustainability, chronic wasting disease, so we have decreased body weight, increased mortality. We're needing more replacements to replace these animals. More resources are going into raising those replacements, and we also get into welfare concerns. Animals with Johne's have shown to have reduced milk production. So we're reducing the milk production of our animals, we're having a higher emission impact per unit, and we also have societal considerations with the fact that it has been postulated to be a zoonotic disease. So as I was working on this presentation, my phone buzzed, and it was a tweet from NPR saying that zoonotic diseases are becoming more and more of a concern. And so this really just ties all in together. We're going to hear more and more about this. And so if we can use genetic improvement to address at least some of it, we can make some progress. Now, last but not least, another trait that you think dairy sustainability, you're going to think feed efficiency and probably think methane emissions as well. We know from research that methane emissions and feed efficiency may be genetically correlated. So as we identify those animals that are more feed efficient, we may also be indirectly selecting for the animals that are lower methane emitters. However, there's currently no direct economic impact for producers. As more emphasis is placed on this from society, this will very likely change. But I would kind of argue that there is currently an economic impact for producers. So we know that there's a net energy loss between 2 and 12% of the animal's energy intake. So if we can reduce this amount, we have reduced methane emissions. The animals are losing less of their feed energy to emissions and saving more of that for production, more efficient animals, and more profit eventually. For current dairy emissions, the dairy cattle production is responsible for approximately 1.9 to 2.5% of annual U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And the majority of this is enteric methane emissions, so those emissions coming from the digestion in the rumen. We said between 2 to 12, approximately 6% of net energy in the cow feed is erected as methane. And we said if we could reduce this amount, then less of that energy is being wasted as emissions, more of it can go towards production. There is progress in this area. One of the projects that is moving us towards this is the Greener Cattle Initiative that CDCB is a founding member of. So this is an industry-oriented research consortium that will award approximately $5 million over the next 5 years, specifically to research looking at ways to mitigate enteric methane emissions from cattle. There's currently a proposal that is going to look at expanding feed efficiency collection that's currently ongoing and adding in those methane emissions with that. So basing on the precedences that we've set from the past and ongoing projects with feed efficiency and incorporating methane emissions. All right, so you're probably sick of hearing from me now, but I promise we are at the tail end of the presentation. So one final plot that in researching for this presentation I came across, and I thought it really captured kind of the take-home message that we have here. So this is from von Kieserlinck in 2013, and we're going from 1950 up to 2010 along the x-axis and showing the percentage change relative to 1950. And if we look at, now I can finally use my pointer, these lines here with massive increases in total milk production and milk production per cow, we know that we've done a really good job increasing production and that's impacting our efficiency. And at the same time, even without directly selecting for reduced emissions, we also have this decrease in methane per kilogram of milk that has been going on as we make these genetic improvements, in addition to improvements in nutrition and management. But we saw that those improvements, a good majority, are coming from genetics as well. So even though we haven't directly said, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to make an index directly looking at sustainability of the dairy industry, we have been making progress towards being more sustainable. So for the take-home points, genetic improvement creates permanent cumulative change. We know that is why genetics is such an effective tool. as we've moved along history and we've incorporated new traits, genetic improvement has moved us towards having higher sustainability, even if that wasn't our goal at the start. Now, I don't say this to be like, okay, we're done, so we've done our job, everything's good. You other people can, fix this whole climate change thing and everything. That's not what I'm saying at all. I don't think anyone in here has the mindset of resting on their laurels or saying that the status quo is enough. The dairy industry, I don't think, is like that at all. We're always looking for more innovations, better ways to do things, ways to make our animals more efficient, and now more sustainable as well. So we need these new traits to come along, like methane emissions and hoof health, that will continue to move us in this goal of reaching more and even increasingly more sustainable industry. So with that, I would like to acknowledge my Agile and CDCB colleagues. I feel like I'm just a storyteller here today, but a lot of the work has been done by the folks there, CDCB members, so DRBCs, breed associations, the dairy records providers, and of course the dairy producers. There's the ones on the ground implementing the things that we come up with and really making the progress there. So thank you for your attention.